when we talk about winning a war, right, there's military and then there's the political side of war. And I wanted to talk about the differences in, given the recent election in Russia, the differences in Russia's political leadership and where Ukraine is at and what that's a reflection of. But Alexander, I'll let you comment first.
Can I throw a question to you, Alexander, real quick on the note that Danny just made? If there were to be a government collapse in Kiev, could the United States use that as a way to prevent a Russian advance? And would the international community say, okay, well, now we have the possibility of getting people in place who can negotiate a peace with Russia? So, all is good now. I mean, could that be something that could happen?
I have to say, I don't think so. I think if we see a government collapse, like we saw in Saigon, for example, which is what basically started to happen in the last few weeks of the war, then I think that the overwhelming sense, both in the West and around the world, will be that Ukraine is unraveling. And the view that will be taken then is we keep away. We stay away. We don't want to be drawn in and dragged down with Ukraine and with this sinking thing. And a collapse is perfectly possible. There could be protests. Military units might mutiny. There's already been lots of discontent in some of the military units. The new commander, General Sirski, appears to have cracked down on that, but it's not popular, and he's not popular. So it's not impossible that there could be a collapse. But I don't think it could be used by the US to stop the Russians. I think the Russians are more likely to say, look, if there's a collapse, a total collapse, then it's even more imperative that we move forward, because if we don't, then chaos will follow. And that was the kind of reasoning that you saw, by the way, also towards the end at the end in Vietnam, when the government in Saigon started to fall apart. It became increasingly clear that the only what was coming was the North Vietnamese. So just saying, I mean, this is my own personal view. If we go back to Danny's point, the key thing to understand about war from a Russian perspective is, well, it comes back to what Alex was saying about Clausewitz. The Russians do not make this great distinction that we make between politics and war. War for them is part of politics. And this is something, again, that we find very difficult to understand, because we come from a completely different political culture, especially Americans, I think, because Americans and British people are we have a civilian culture with a military attached to it. Whereas in Russia, it isn't like that. The two are much more involved with each other. So there's a seamless web from the one to the other. I think that from the Russian perspective, war is always a total thing. I mean, they don't make the distinction that we make between total war and non-total war either. If you find yourself in a war, every single resource that you have is focused upon achieving your objective. And that is, I think, very much how the Russians are thinking. And Putin's election reflects this. The size of his majority in the election reflects this also. When there is a conflict situation, Russian society tends to consolidate, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The event in Crocus City Hall is going to intensify that process even more. The economy is gearing up increasingly to providing the weapons to make sure that the war is won. We see thousands of people joining the army in that kind of situation. So this is the kind of way in which the Russians think. The Ukrainians don't think that way. They on the contrary, have a much more diffuse, decentralized political system. I suspect because ultimately Ukraine never fully matured as a state system. So you don't have a kind of strong state in the way that you do in Russia. And that is a factor that makes a collapse in Ukraine much more likely, whereas it makes a collapse in Russia all but impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reports that you mentioned, Alex, about MPs in the Servant of the People party, talking about, several, a major number of them saying that there's no point to even being an MP because the parliament is in effect a rubber stamp for whatever Zelensky wants to do. We don't even really have to work. We want to go. And Danilov, Alexei Danilov, he is gone after making some just horrific remark after remark. I mean, he is quite the character. Back last year, insulting the intelligence of Chinese, Indians, the Indians, like talking about Asians being less than human. He also mispronounced recently China's envoy, Li Hui, his name to symbolize a part of the body that in Russian and in Ukrainian is not very flattering. And then, of course, I think the most disgusting thing that he did right before he left was make light and make fun of. And some people were saying he revealed that Ukraine is definitely involved because he was talking about how fun everything was going in Moscow during the Crocus attack. But this is the kind of thing. You have Zelensky hiding in a bunker. You have guys like Danilov in major positions. And you have, Russia, on the other hand, you have Vladimir Putin, a stable leader who, after this attack, was talking about humanism, was talking about, ensuring the safety, especially of groups who may be targeted after this, like the Tajiks in Russia. Like, just a completely different, if you just look at it that way, you never have this in the Western mainstream media where there's an actual look at, well, how does this reflect on how things are actually going in this conflict when you have a society at war like Russia getting remarkably more stable, and then you have the other side that we have been told has either been winning or in a stalemate or in trouble but could win in 2025, looking the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think the other big narrative that's going to crumble is this whole Zelensky's this Churchill figure, and the Ukraine government's this democratic human rights Western values type of government. That thing's going to crumble. That's going to be really embarrassing when that narrative crumbles. But these guys were never statesmen. They were never professionals. I mean, Zelensky, at the end of the day, Zelensky and his entire staff were a bunch of TV producers. They were actors and TV producers, all of them, from Yermak to Zelensky to one time Arestovich. Arestovich is now gone, but they were never at the caliber of Putin and his team. And in Danilov, the thing that what he called the Chinese diplomat, it's a terrible word in Russian. I mean, like the worst word, one of the worst words in Russian. So, I mean, these guys, they're awful. They're absolutely awful. And with each passing day, they're getting worse. They're making demands of the West. Kuleba, the other day in Politico, is like, give us the damn Patriots. I mean, they're really getting belligerent. They're making demands. I predict that there's going to be a lot of people in the West who are going to get sick and tired of these guys. I'll put money on it. They're probably, when Zelensky calls them, I'm sure there's a bunch of people in the West who are like, my God, I don't want to talk to this guy. I don't want to talk to the people on his team. I'm tired of them. They're not helping their own cause at all. And Kuleba, he's top diplomat in Ukraine, and the way he talks is anything but diplomatic. Compare him to Lavrov, you can't. So it's a train wreck. This whole thing is a train wreck. But when that narrative about Churchill, when that thing comes crashing down, look out.
I just want to add a few things, and this is something I wanted to discuss, and Alex can confirm it. I think a point which many people who are not Russians don't realize is that bad language in Russia carries an exceptionally strong charge. It's not something you do lightly. And if you do it in a public situation, if you do it in a formal setting as a statesperson, it is even more shocking to Russians. And by the way, Ukrainians, because the culture is so similar, it is far more shocking to them than it would be in the West. I mean, it is, I mean, people absolutely loathe it. I mean, they might, use strong language in private with each other, but even there, Westerners who go to Russia are always very strongly advised not to try to use strong language, to use strong Russian words, because it's a dangerous thing to do. So what Danilov did was just way out, even by Ukrainian and Russian standards. I mean, it was just, people in Ukraine would have been appalled. I can say that with confidence, and I think Alex would confirm this. So moving on from that, why are they talking in this way? Because they're getting desperate. I mean, they're becoming increasingly frightened, and they're getting desperate, and they're talking in this extreme language and making these extreme demands, and that's a reflection of it. And some of them, exactly as Alex says, are looking for ways out. They're looking for bolt holes to escape before everything falls apart. The fact that Danilov spoke in this way, the fact that Kuleba spoke in this way, the fact that by many accounts Kuleba turns up drunk to meetings is a sign that things are going very badly wrong. And as for Zelensky, we've discussed this many times in many programs. Outside the West, but to some extent now even in the West, when people encounter him, when world leaders encounter him, they don't like him. Prime Minister Modi of India didn't like him. President Lula of Brazil is absolutely furious with him and won't have any contact with him because Zelensky failed to turn up to a meeting that he was supposed to go to. MBS of Saudi Arabia was furious. And you could find many examples of this. Even some of the people in Congress in the United States, when they encountered Zelensky in person, were not impressed. So these are people who have been elevated to political positions that they're not remotely qualified for. And I'm afraid it's showing. And as things fall apart, it shows even more. I suspect the reason they're there, by the way, is because the people who put them there basically didn't want strong personalities. They wanted people that they could control. And that's, the oligarchs in Ukraine who pull the strings, the Western powers to some extent. And the result is that Ukraine, as I said previously, has never matured as a state and has never produced statesmen and stateswomen. It has never done that. And at a time of crisis, that increasingly shows.
Yeah, and it is quite remarkable when you have Danilov speak in this way to a Chinese envoy who is simply saying that Russia needs to be part of any kind of peace agreement. That became so offensive to someone like Alexei Danilov that he had to go. And there was in the video, which I won't play, but in the video, you see the host of the Ukrainian television like laughing because she knows what he said. That's how putrid this guy is. But I think you're exactly right, Alexander. This does show a level of desperation. And I noticed too that Zelensky is not at the forefront. He's not in the forefront anymore in the Western media, in the Western press. There isn't as much bragging about Zelensky's leadership and how incredible he is doing and what he's doing, his leadership. That all of that has left. That ship has well sailed. We don't really hear much about this chaos outside of very brief reports anymore, and I think that in of itself speaks volumes, given the opposite is true in Russia, and they can't even hide the truth in Russia. I read a Washington Post article. It was incredible. On the day of the election, or on the eve of the election in Russia, there was supposedly Washington Post reporters in Belgorod, and they were talking to people there, and literally everyone that they spoke to said, we're going to vote for Putin harder because of these attacks that Ukraine and their forces and those they're sponsoring are conducting. We're going to vote for him harder. We support him even more. We support what Russia is doing even more because they're the ones protecting us. So I think it's astounding to see where things have gone, especially in relation to the tale of two political systems.
Well, indeed. I mean, if I can just come back again to Danilov, I mean, the very last thing that Ukraine ought to be doing at this time is antagonizing China. It's about the only country that might be able to actually help Ukraine in this situation. I mean, they have influence over the Russians. They have leverage. About the only people who do. And, if Xi Jinping picked up the telephone and called Putin, Putin would listen to what Xi Jinping says. So Xi Jinping and his envoy are people that a wise Ukrainian government should work very, very hard to keep happy. And at various times, the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, who spoke to Xi Jinping about a year ago, we remember we discussed this actually on one of your shows, I think, Dan. Zelensky in the past has shown some understanding of it. So has Kuleba. And now, of course, here comes Danilov, and he behaves in this grotesque way. So that shows the unbalanced people that there are in Kiev and in power in Kiev. And as for the fact that people in Belgorod support Putin and people across Russia support Putin, well, in any country which finds itself at war, there is an instinct to consolidate around the government. That's by definition. Given what has happened and given Russian history, that instinct to consolidate in Russia is even greater. And what I have never understood is, do Western governments want Putin to remain indefinitely president of Russia? Because if they do, then they're going about it in exactly the right way. The sanctions, the abuse, the constant pressure, the meddling in Russian affairs, all of these, the conflict with Ukraine, all of that is all it's going to do is make Russians feel that they should support Putin even more because he's the leader of their country. Now, it should not be difficult to work that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were rumors, I don't know if these are verified, that the United States, there was a directive to circumvent and undermine the election in Russia to any degree that was possible. Of course, I think everything that was attempted, I think whatever Russian opposition exists in Russia is so weak, especially we haven't even gotten to Navalny and his death and how that kind of reflects where the so-called opposition is. But anyway, continue.
Well, I mean, we haven't, but perhaps we should, because I mean, look, I mean, when you start saying that queues of people going to vote is a sign of protest, then you are really desperate. I mean, that's what it came to. I mean, I have to say, when I read that, and by the way, every single newspaper in Britain was running with this story, which is astonishing. I was thinking to myself, what planet are these people on? I mean, it really was one of the most bizarre things I have ever seen.
Yeah. The election interference, I think, it was that Navalny, the Navalny story. That was their election play, and that's probably all they could do when you think about it. I mean, they weren't able to do anything else as far as trying to prevent Putin from winning. I mean, that they understood that. So I guess Yolanda Navalny, that was their election strategy. You got to just going back to the stuff that Danilov says and the stuff that the Ukraine leadership says, the stupid stuff, the reckless stuff that they say. Maybe we shouldn't be so hard on them, actually, because if their example are the leaders of the collective West. That's who they're looking at, and the leaders of the collective West, they're going around saying Xi Jinping's a dictator. When Biden just met Xi Jinping, 24 hours later, he's calling him a dictator. Yesterday, Biden called Putin a butcher. A month ago, he called him an SOB. Right. The European leaders aren't saying anything nicer about Putin or anybody else. That's not part of the EU family. So, I guess, I don't know, maybe in a weird way, the leaders in Kiev are saying, well, if Biden and Annalena and Olaf Trudeau, if they can say nasty stuff about the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians, well, so can we. They're probably looking at the leaders in the West, and they want to be like them. So I don't know, just a thought.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.